You're listening to Gradient Dissent, a show about making machine learning work in the real world. And I'm your host, Lukas Biewald. Today I'm talking with a super unexpected guest. Some of my colleagues thought this was an April Fool's joke that I was even setting up this interview. It's with Martin Shkreli, who I originally became aware of, probably like a lot of you, as the pharma bro, right? This young pharmaceutical CEO who was raising prices on consumers and quickly became one of America's most hated people. I didn't really follow that for years, but then he resurfaced on Twitter and was actually talking about weights and biases and had really thoughtful feedback on our product, had gone incredibly deep into PyTorch's innards, and I kind of couldn't believe how technically competent he was. And then I looked at the product he was building with weights and biases, and we had a nice connection as fellow entrepreneurs. So I really wanted to have him on this podcast. And so, of course, we talk about what his experience was like getting canceled and going to jail. And I give an opportunity to talk about sort of his version of the events. But we also go super deep on AI and drug discovery, something a lot of our guests have talked about, but he has a really interesting, different take on that. And we also go deep into his trading product and how he built it and his entrepreneurial strategies. We also talk about what it's like to go to jail and what his experience of jail was like, and some advice that he gave Sam Bankman-Fried recently on going to jail. So this is a really wide-ranging interview that I found fascinating, and I hope you enjoy it. Martin, thanks for being on this show. I mean, you're probably the most professional live streamer that we've had on here. So
Thanks for having me.
yeah, absolutely. Before you started talking about weights and biases on Twitter, I really knew you as, I think, just vaguely as someone who, was kind of buying pharma companies and then raising prices, and you're known as like the pharma bro. I've seen you online, like kind of correcting or like telling your side of the story, but I thought maybe I'd just offer you the chance to. I'm actually curious, honestly, to hear, your take on those events before we get into the AI stuff.
Yeah, I mean, well, obviously, if you do something really noteworthy that sticks out, it sort of takes over, your life and kind of how people look at you and what you do. And I think, that probably happened to the Hawk to a Girl or any of these
Totally.
other people where it's like, hey, you're on front page news. This is what people remember you forever. But before that happened, people I think remembered me as an investor or a trader, and then also as a biopharma guy. And I'd basically done everything you could do in biopharma, whether it's discover new drugs, develop drugs, license drugs, acquire drug companies. I went public at 28, my age. Not that that part's that relevant, but I had some very successful drug companies. I did a lot of the things that Vivek Ramaswamy did. In fact, he was my biggest investor. And, we just kind of saw the drug industry as this very fragmented kind of modular industry where each drug is very similar to each other. Whereas in software industry, your company maybe has really nothing to do with, say, something like a rival, not a rival, but like, say, I don't know, a ServiceNow, or, maybe a company like CrowdStrike or something. It's not really, they're pretty apples and oranges. Whereas pharma has they're very similar overlapping properties, whether it's, they're all the drugs sort of work a certain way. There's a certain toxicology. There's a certain pharmacokinetics. They're very, very sort of much members of a class, so to speak. And I think that, we basically saw this industry as just this massive collection of class members that was generally not well arbitraged. The individual companies would trade on the stock market, but within those individual companies, say a Pfizer or Merck, they'd have 1,000 different assets, and the company's management team would have to decide, well, we like this one or we don't like this one. And they'd make smart bets sometimes, and they make not so smart bets sometimes. And sometimes they make bets that traded off a certain utility for them that they're willing to forego for us. So I think a lot of people have since sort of gotten into that business. It's got a little trickier, but it's still this really fragmented business. So that was my main focus for a long time. And so I know the drug industry really well. And the finance industry really well. So for me, kind of doing the hedge fund world and then moving into more of a private equity pharma style treatment of the world was really helpful. I think that a lot of traders come to Wall Street, they want to make money, but then what I think you realize over time is trading is really tedious, really difficult, really like going to tear your hair out. And you learn all these fascinating stories. You meet fascinating people like yourself, and you start to realize that you love kind of the story, the industry, the people, the products, the all the lore. Is really fun. And private equity is one of these things. Whether you're kind of a VC is sort of a form of private equity, if you ask me. But whether you're starting a company, buying a company, kind of doing a little bit of all of the above, you sort of are getting your hands dirty. And I think that's, for me, I realized that I was 100 million times better at that than I was at investing or trading. So that's kind of how I got into pharma. I certainly have always looked at software as well, but we could talk about that as you wish.
But so wait, so you came from originally from a more trading perspective than coming from like the deep pharma. Like you don't have like a biology background, right?
No, but when there's money on the line, you force yourself to learn as fast as you can. And I was fortunate that working for Jim Cramer to start, and then working for so-called Tiger Cub, I was able to really get to talk to these management teams or the analysts or whatever on a one-to-one basis. So sometimes I feel like I learned a lot of the stuff both through hard work and my own perseverance, but also like I got to see how the drug industry worked pretty up close.
And was this actually like my thought was like you were buying existing drugs, like not like doing like science to discover new drugs. Is that right?
Yeah, no, I did a lot of science. So, we got a lot of publications at JMedChem. Um, for example, it's the big sort of journal for medicinal chemistry. Did a lot of crystallography, preclinical work. So I've done it all, sort of taking a drug from an idea in my head. I remember the McDonald's where one of my business partners and I sat down and sketched out molecules for pantothenate derivatives.
You
And
literally like sketching out a molecule on a
yeah,
napkin? Really?
yeah, yeah. Yeah,
Wow.
I mean, I grew up as a nerd. It's there's sort of a self-taught nerd, but a very deep nerd. Um, and Panthenate is a vitamin B5, and in a certain disease, children can't make or process vitamin B5 into its active form because they're missing an enzyme called panthenate kinase. And we just said, well, if you're missing this enzyme that converts pantothenate to phosphopantothenate, we could create phosphopantothenate. And we are able to sort of get the basic idea of it down. Of course, I worked with a lot of brilliant chemists. One of my chemists worked for, a famous Nobel Prize winner and some other people like that. But I think, probably in management, I think you maybe have a lot to say about this too. You want to know how the whole company works, right? I'm certainly was never the best chemist at any of the companies I started, and I certainly wasn't the best biologist. But I knew enough to ask the right questions, like, why won't this, for example, why is this drug looks like it's going to have very low log P. How is this drug going to be useful? And you don't have to be, the perfect, person at every single job, but I think you should know a little bit about this. So when a lot of the other pharma companies criticized me, I would often point to their CEOs and say, do you even know much about medicinal chemistry or some of these other areas that are really knee deep in the pharma industry? And so for me, whether it's software or pharma or any other industry, I really do want to know, how the sausage is made and get my hands a little bit dirty. So it didn't happen overnight. I mean, that took 15 years of pretty hard work before some of these things started to dawn on me. And again, I'm not the perfect person for any of these exact disciplines. I don't push production code at our company, for example.
Well, look, I totally respect that, but I think the criticism was right. Wasn't it like, hey, you're like buying an existing drug and then raising the price? Like, is that I don't know, is that accurate or what's your?
Yeah, that was the criticism. I mean, I think that it's one of these situations where don't ever let the facts get in the way of a good story. The good story was like, here's this guy, he's like really unabashed sort of um, champion for capitalism, and he's doing all these things and saying all these things, and you should not like him. And what's a wonderful story, for a film or something. But the reality is, very, very different. Our drug had, for example, many other drugs that were replacement goods. You could have taken just simply another medicine for very little. But it would mess up the story. And then there were other things like, well, I didn't take a salary at the company or anything like that. There was no like need, our company wasn't profitable. It was a very small drug. It was actually still relatively inexpensive because I guess when you do the multiplication of the price, well, that seems like an awful lot, but you really have to look at the absolute price as well as the relative price. So there's still on an absolute basis, there were drugs that were millions of dollars. So this drug was, a fraction of that. It was a very small fraction of that. And today we still have drugs that are $1 million per year per person. And there's very limited understanding of the orphan drug industry, which is one of the best. I mean, one of the deep regrets I have is that I think obscured some of the great work that pharma companies do in orphan drugs, which is my specialty. The panasonic medicine I mentioned earlier, that's a disease where maybe 500 people have this disease, but it's pediatric, it's fatal, and the biology is fairly clear and simple to sort of get over the hump and make a potential cure for this disease. So to me, I mean, when you have 500 people that are your addressable market, I mean, you're going to have to charge $1 million a patient. There's no other way. And I think a lot of people, when you put that to them, they realize that, well, would I rather have the patient who's a child die, or have a insurance company who's massive and rich and has no problem paying $1 million, because it's only 500 people, would rather have them pay for it? And the answer is just totally obvious. The families, I'm still in touch with some of the families that have children with this disease. So I feel like, the price increase in and of itself, we had done this like 6 or 7 times before, and we never had a problem with patient access. In fact, patient access tends to go up because we can now afford to sort of provide for these patients. So there was just a lot of stuff where, it's this generic theme of, are you going to use your rational mind or emotional mind? And for so many people, they want to use their emotional mind. And I'm really lucky that, I started podcasting or webcasting and live streaming in a time where nobody did it. It was, 2015. And I basically said, I can't win. I do these interviews and they still try to make me look bad. So I'm just going to show you who I am. And I just would turn my camera on and go at it. And a lot of people would watch that. In fact, our most of our seed or pre-seed investors, you can see those on our website. It's like a lot of the guys in tech that we all know and love. And they watched my videos and said, well, hold on, everyone's got this guy all wrong. He's like one of us. He sits in programs, he sits and hacks away at a spreadsheet. He's showing us how to be entrepreneurs. And some of these guys ended up becoming some of the biggest entrepreneurs. For example, Prasanna, who co-founded Rippling, Amjad, who co-founded Replit, Peterson brothers with Flexport. And these guys did really well. And many of them credit my videos for teaching them some fundamental analysis and financial statements and things like that, which you do have to sort of learn when you become a CEO. And, the people who did that, they have sort of had a strong conviction that I wasn't a bad guy, whereas the millions of people who watched the sort of traditional media clips had a very small conviction that I was a bad guy. So the people had a huge conviction that I was a good guy. To me, that's more important than trying to make like every single person love you, because, it's sort of hard to do. And the people who do love you or do think you're a good person, they'll vouch for you, and that will tend to spread it through network effects. I'm really lucky that, people like the folks I mentioned and so many more have vouched for me, and through network effects have sort of said, no, this isn't, this guy isn't as bad as they say he is. In fact, he's really great. And I'm just super lucky that I've been able to do that, because oftentimes, when someone's radioactive, they tend to just sort of get, cast aside, they're pariah. There's no way to redeem them. And I feel like, we also happen to live in an environment, there's a bit of luck here, where in general, people are sort of taking second looks at people and saying, well, I don't know if I should believe that. And that has good effects and bad effects, because, there's folks that, or things in general that, we should be skeptical of, or something like that. And, say ivermectin or something like that. Ivermectin isn't really a great treatment for anything. But ultimately, because there's this skepticism of authority, whether it's in the form of government or in the form of media or whatever, folks are almost like becoming so contrarian that they're saying, well, in fact, I take ivermectin every day. I'm gonna show you. And it's sort of a funny sort of dynamic, but I benefit from that dynamic. And I'm glad that some people have sort of taken a second look at me and after the media stuff and said, I rather like this guy.
I also think that like it creates this world where it's sort of like admitting like any like nuance or gray area is like taken as this like immediate sign of guilt, and you get this response of like, hey, like I just completely invalidate the other side. Like, in your case, like I'm sitting outside of it, and I'm a capitalist, like I understand, like you want to make like a profitable drugs so that you like serve a group, especially a group where it's like a, rare disease and they may not be getting treatments anywhere else. But I can also like imagine it's like being involved in a scenario where someone like can't afford a life-saving drug just seems like so horrible. Like did that like actually happen or it
I,
just
I
never
you know,
did
I,
or
I'm a humanist. I would never let that happen. I didn't get into the drug business only to make money. There's also this glory of, as I said earlier, with the pantothenate disease, there's this glory of saying, I'm going to use, this God-given ability, whether it's just, a little bit of, knowledge, a little bit of privilege, whatever it is, and I'm going to use it, to do cool things. And, writing code for me as a kid was awesome. I loved it. But the chance to make a medicine was like 100 times cooler because, this was the same way code, you write code and it does something, you make a molecule and it does something. And it's a little bit more difficult to program, it's a little more abstract, but nevertheless, your body's kind of the compiler, and, you get the outcome. So designing a drug is an awesome, joy. And, it sucks that, this price increase, which again, I still defend to the death, would obscure that. So I feel like, you know, it's just it's a tough place to be when no one wants to hear um, your points. And I think that one of the things that I tried to sort of this is again a lot of this is self-serving to be clear, but one of the things that I really wanted to do with infectious disease in general was, and this was in 2015, was to try to sort of make infectious disease a more sturdy system. At the time, like and really since time immemorial, the general idea of infectious disease drugs was that we would develop them after the infection showed up. It was really bad. And then it's like, okay, now we got to do something. And that's a really crazy perspective because if you think about it, things like coronavirus were well known at the time, and things like again toxoplasmosis. This is a drug. The one of the drug I raised the price of was about 70 years old, 70, and nobody had ever made a better version of it. And it's like we should constantly be sort of like it's not a pip install, but like it's close enough to like you want to sort of have like a better version of this stuff, and have the version number go up because, for example, in the drug in question, the enzyme is called dihydrofolate reductase. It's a very commonly studied enzyme, DHFR, but the parasite's enzyme and the human's enzyme differ slightly. And the question is, can you thread the needle so that you make a drug that only blocks the parasite's enzyme but does not block the human enzyme? That kind of idea didn't exist 70 years ago. So we made one that just blocks the parasites, and you could take gobs of it and nothing will happen to you. Whereas with the antiparasitic, right now, if you take gobs of it, you get very sick. So these kinds of upgrades were necessary, but generally the medical system, the pharmaceutical system was like, look, if it's not on fire, why fix it? And as a result, in general, you probably at some point read a story about how bad the antibiotics business is. And as a result, the drug industry stops making antibiotics. Well, now if there's antibiotic resistance, we really need that. So the problem is the lead time to make a new drug is about 10 years. So you're really talking about, a really tough space with really sort of odd diseases, West Nile virus. There's one called Chagas disease where there's no FDA-approved drug. Chagas disease is actually quite common relative to something like toxoplasmosis. It's a Latin American disease mostly, and it tends to find its way to America often. And even without that, it's a very difficult disease to treat. It's a very severe disease. And no American companies or labs were ever interested in Chagas. And it's like, look, people are dying of Chagas disease. And I don't think it was a bad thing to have a company that was going to stand there and say, we're going to make the infectious disease drugs nobody wants to make. And that company, again, could have had a coronavirus antiviral ready to go day one. So infectious disease, as the world becomes more local, but also, theoretically, I mean, I hate to say this, but like, the AI kind of doomsday nightmare scenario, which I don't believe in personally, but the Eliezer, the Yudkowsky kind of theory, the doomer theory that, oh, these AIs will let us just print viruses, like that'll infect the world really quickly. It's probably reasonable that some company has, that capability of dealing with infectious disease really rapidly and aggressively. And so we were sort of trying to be that company at the time. And it was just it was an idea that was a little bit before its time and still an idea that isn't going to be liked. People just hate the drug industry for some reason. It's a really terrible thing. I think people in general should love the drug industry. If for example, cystic fibrosis has sort of now been defeated by a great drug company in Boston. And many other illnesses like Hep C is now totally curable very easily. These are huge human triumphs. I mean, I'm all for celebrating our triumphs in computer science too, but these are really big triumphs as well in biopharma, and we still kind of treat this industry with scorn. And it was really frustrating to see that, and also kind of contribute to it.
Well, it's probably a function of, when you're sort of like desperate and like need like a medication and feel like, it's expensive, right? I mean, I'm sure that's like a terrible feeling. It's interesting. We do a lot of work with almost all the, pharma companies at this point. We've had a whole bunch of the people on the podcast, which is why I was surprised to find, tweet of yours where you're sort of saying AI and drug discovery have nothing to do with each other, which is kind of a hot take because actually, like these days, I think in the last couple of years, most of the pharma companies have become Weights and Biases customers, and not small ones, right? Like they're big teams that are working on drug discovery. So I'm kind of curious, like, do you think that's like a wasted effort and impossible, or where you come from?
I have a super high conviction on this, so I hope every VC watches it, and I'm happy to discuss this matter further. But ultimately, in drug discovery, your major bottleneck is idea, and it's a little like software, right? Your major bottleneck is what do I point my clinical trial, medicinal chemistry, toxicology apparatus at? And in general, the idea is there's some protein target in the body somewhere that you want to change its function or stop its function or augment it or whatever. And a great example is Dupixent, which has become one of the largest drugs ever from Sanofi in France and Regeneron in here in New York. It's a wonderful medicine. It's very expensive medicine, but it's just a game changer for a few different diseases, asthma, eczema, et cetera. And the secret of Dupixent wasn't like anything other than just picking this molecular target. After that, making an antibody to something is very easy. We've had that technology for 30, 40 years. Making a small molecule is very easy. This is what a chemist does. Can AI assist those two things, which are about 10% of the process, the actual invention of the drug? Then you have to actually test it in people, which is the other 90%. But, those all kind of break down. So I actually did this on a live stream where I broke down the entire drug discovery process and pinpointed the parts where like AI could do something in. And there were very small parts of the sort of system that AI could help in. And probably the biggest part is the LLM part. So one of the things I did with my girlfriend, who's, for full disclosure, she works at over at OpenAI. We asked GPT to come up with a good drug target, and it gave us a list that was okay. But then we said, well, let's put this in for loop and ask for every human protein, could you turn this into a medicine? Could an inhibitor or whatever it might be, could interacting with this protein be useful in a disease context? If you actually did run this for loop and we had a stronger system, GPT is great, but next generation, you actually could sort of like change the drug industry. But the actual like chemistry part of it, I think it's all LARP. Like if you show a chemist a protein, or a crystal structure, I mean, you can make a basic inhibitor and like, it's almost like, those kids that like do their arithmetic test very quickly and stuff like that. Like to a chemist, it's really not that crazy. Now you still have like atomic roadblocks where it's like, okay, I have to actually make this thing now. And then I have to go see if it works in real life. The systems we have to test those through in silico, as we call them, they're okay, but like you still want to know it works in real life. And then you got to go give it to some animals, which AI is not going to help because you have the lowest form of intelligence that we want to give these drugs to see if there are side effects and things like that. So in general, like the idea that we could chemistry efforts would be helped by AI or other drug discovery components like say antibody creation. There have been for 20 or 30 years different like Bayesian approaches to like get slightly better output. So instead of screening like 100 million molecules, you can screen 10 million molecules or something like that. But we're not gated by that. To screen 100 billion molecules is very doable with today's computers and doing it serially and like brute force. And you don't get better results by screening like 100 trillion or 100 quadrillion molecules. It doesn't really help you very much. So the gating AI is, we're here because, we love this technology and we're really interested in it. and you built one of the best companies in the space about it. But where can you actually leverage it in a way that's real and really going to game change? I think that's the secret. There's a disease. I'll just pick a random disease, but say Sjogren's disease. This weird autoimmune disease. It's Swedish. I always pronounce it wrong. It's Sjogren. So it's like Sjogren's or Sjogren's. And there's various other diseases like this where there's no great treatment. I was developing a drug for a rare kidney disease called focal segmental glomerulosclerosis, another disease that's really tough to treat. And between Sjogren's and FSGS, the big win here is how, why, where, how do we actually, treat this disease? Now, AI could help a little bit, like say in the lab. So what some people are doing is they're taking like RNA readouts and having AI sort of look through those transcripts, which are like voluminous data and kind of difficult to like parse. Personally, I think the harder thing is to just read the medical literature. This is actually, very few people know this, but this is what got me into AI. So Vivek and I had these like rival companies, but also friendly. And our theory was what I espoused earlier, which is like, we need to go find the world's hidden gems of medicines. They could be anywhere. They could be a big drug company, small drug companies. They could be at universities, but there's one common link. Everyone publishes in a database called PubMed. And there are 38,000 papers, 38 million papers in PubMed. And so what Vivek and I did was we scaled our teams up as big as we could for humans to read these papers. And this is a time when we also had IBM and Watson come in and try to teach us the latest in NLP. And I started a little NLP company because I basically looked at my team and I said, I love these guys. They're a group of PhDs and other really bright people. But there's about 18 people. And I said, you have to look at the entire world's scholastic output on medicine. And Vivek had a team of like 80 people. So he was like scaling harder and faster. And our basic job was to go read every paper about every new medicine and try to see if we should go license it or buy it or fund it. And I said to myself, the gaining thing here is intelligence. It's human intelligence. I'll give you a really good example. There was an enzyme called BTK, Bruton's tyrosine kinase. In 1980s, there were studies around Bruton's tyrosine kinase or BTK that showed that it was going to be a key drug for autoimmune disease. The protein was a key player in autoimmune disease. Only 15 or 20 years later did somebody say, let's make a drug and let's block this enzyme. It turned out to be one of the greatest medicines ever. And so all that needed to happen is somebody had to read that paper and translate it clinically. And I feel like today you could do that with GPT. GPT could read every paper and say, I think this could become a drug. And slowly but surely, if you read all 36 million of those PubMed papers and you say, okay, GPT, of the top 1,000, what are the very, very best ones? And Pfizer and Merck could say, oh, maybe we should make this drug. And I feel like that is kind of the real area where we can win. The human intelligence part is really the gating item of all these things. And remember, clinical trials are kind of like 50 to 70% of the cost of these things. And this is just like paying people to sit there and wait and see what happens with their medicine. So like there's just a finite amount of help that AI can have to begin with. And then there's regulatory time, which is probably not going to be helped either. So you've got, there's animal time where you have to do the same exact stuff that you do with people and animals. So there's like very little narrow parts of drug discovery that could even be applicable in. And even in those parts, it feels like, there isn't a lot to do. So to me, when I think of AI, I mix in drug discovery, I don't think about the transformer LLM side, which I think is the side that I think about where it could be useful. I think what most people think about is like, can you make a foundation model for chemistry or something like that? And I feel like that's not, sort of going to be too fruitful.
It's interesting though. I mean, I think everyone would acknowledge that most of the expense is in the clinical trials, but like kind of setting that aside, it does seem like, there are these lots and lots of smart people, at big companies and also at like Isomorphic and at Citro and, and have built these big organizations that have kind of convinced investors this is important. Like, I mean, can you like steel man their argument a little bit for me? I'm trying to like channel them because that's been more of the I mean, what's like happening here? Yeah, surely like where's the difference in their thinking and yours?
Yeah, I mean, I think they think that drug discovery is harder than I do. I feel like they think that target ID is something that they can either do better at, because I've seen some of these sort of stacks, so to speak, of some of these companies, and some of them are correctly kind of like pointing to
we're trying to look at, say, patient data, combine that with biomedical data, and then, just sort of try to take all this data, throw it at a wall and see what happens. But the best medicines that have ever been made tend to be like this laser focus of, this is a big medical problem, say Alzheimer's. And where and how do we figure out how to treat Alzheimer's? Nobody's figured it out yet. Well, there are some companies that say, let's take blood samples or gene samples from 100,000 people with Alzheimer's. Well, that's a really good idea. It doesn't require AI. It's plain old machine learning to like, k-means clustering or something to like look at the data and say, this is where the bad stuff's happening. And sometimes you don't even need, even advanced math for that. I mean, you just can see that, ApoE is a protective allele for Alzheimer's. Maybe we should make an ApoE mimetic or something like that. And, I think that most of the ideas in drug discovery don't require these hidden features, these representation learning that we've been taught AI can see in ways that humans can't. If anything, you almost want to be able to, you kind of need to be able to see it for it to work. And so much of medicine is fairly transparent. Like Huntington's disease is a good example. We know exactly what causes Huntington's disease. It's a malformation. It's a so-called polyQ repeat of this Huntington protein. And, it's a terrible, terrible phenotype. I mean, it's a lethal illness. The problem isn't the problem here is how do you actually make the drug? The target is well known. It's one of these very frustrating diseases because you know exactly what you need to do, but it's very tricky to do. So, for example, CRISPR in general is sort of like a curative idea for all genetic diseases. The problem with CRISPR is you can't deliver it to target cells. So CRISPR won't get into the brain cells, for example. It'll get into liver cells quite well, but not into brain cells. So the technology required there is you have to sort of make a better screwdriver. And could AI help there? I mean, I think to the extent we get super intelligence, it might be able to say, okay, what you're all missing is that this is the way to sneak CRISPR inside of brain cells. But, so much of this is serendipity, and so much of this is stuff that, is so hard to plan. Innovation in general is kind of hard to force. And I feel like, these companies, some of them that you mentioned, they're all good people. They're all really smart people, but we've seen this movie before in biotech, and it's actually very funny. So when the human genome was decoded, there was a company called Human Genome Sciences, and they said, well, we're going to be the winner here because genomics is a really big revolution. They weren't the winner. When push came to shove, they had to make medicines. And when that part, as you know from the VC game, once things sort of get real, where it's okay, you have revenue now. Now we have to grow the revenue and grow the earnings. That's when all of the imaginary stuff kind of gets thrown away. And in the drug business, it's the same thing. It's once you put a drug into people, you now have to that drug has to work and it has to change people's lives for the better, or your company's worthless. And so I think so many of those companies are going to cross into that chasm where it's okay, all the talk's over. What medicines do you have and what do they do? And that's just a biotech company. That's just a drug company. And I feel there's almost never been a strategic advantage in technology and medicine. So the strategic advantage is almost always what's your idea? So when antibodies came around the scene, within a few years, everyone had the technology. And to this day, antibodies are a modality for making a drug, but it's not an end in and of itself. And AI is the same way. I could use, some sort of AI techniques to filter drug candidates for some disease. But if that disease isn't severe enough to merit a drug at all, there are some diseases that are so borderline in severity that they're probably not worth making a drug. Or if this drug is not blocking that enzyme, isn't really going to do much for that disease, the AI is being misplaced and not used in the right way. So you still need that human judgment to sort of think about what target am I going after? And that's where I really think you could have a GPT pharmaceuticals that actually kind of made decisions on, let's make a drug that targets this disease, say Huntington's or asthma or something like that. And here are the next steps, dear humans. And I think that would probably work way better than trying to take machine learning or deep learning techniques and apply them to actual wet lab stuff or drug discovery stuff, which is still this sort of relatively easy and mundane process that doesn't need that extra intelligence. I think the extra intelligence, it's sort of, I guess the theme of the point here is that the tail's wagging the dog. The intelligence goes in the front end, and everything that comes downstream from there is actually fairly easy to do and deterministic almost. But the front end decision of we're making an antibody to this enzyme, WANDB, it's this terrible enzyme. And if we don't inhibit it, it's going to, cause cancer. And, that's the kind of strategy that has to be delineated first. And then, hopefully the drug works and does great things.
So is that why? I mean, you're not really working in this industry anymore, right?
Not really, no.
What, I guess, why not? Like, it seems like you're super passionate about it. And is it like wanting to try something different, or like what, or it feels like a dead end?
I have one regulatory barrier to it, which I do think could be sort of overcome if necessary. But I also think there's a few other things. I mean, one, software is just awesome. It's just nothing like it. It's so great to write software and watch people use your product and watch it grow. The next thing I'd say is like the drug industry is very capital intensive. It's very, like, for example, like I was sort of, when I started my first drug company, I really did an outstanding job of holding onto the equity of the company. And I got to hold like 10% of the equity at the end. For most software people, they think that's crazy. That is a really low amount for a software company, but most biotech people are really jealous of me. They're like, how'd you get to own that much? That's insane. Meanwhile, you have companies self-funding and owning 100%.
Right.
So to me, like it's a financially kind of strange business. You get a lot of scale, packaged in a drug company, but you can get a lot of scale in software too, and you don't have to take the dilution. So as an investor, SaaS has just been a miracle. This is what didn't used to be this way, by the way. In the enterprise software days in the 90s, you couldn't just sort of open up an enterprise software company. It was really difficult. And, it was a huge effort. Now, everything's changed and it's changing by the day. So I feel like the reward is pretty big there. Again, pharma is one of these places where you can make the next, like Vertex literally made the cure for cystic fibrosis. And Bernie Sanders said, why is it so expensive? It's like, wow, we just did a miracle. We're saving 30,000 people's lives that would normally die. I had a friend die of cystic fibrosis. And, the first question is, how dare we reward these people for doing this amazing technical achievement? And it's funny is that, you could be a great AI researcher and you know this way better than I do. And you can plop yourself in San Francisco and make $1 million a year relatively easily. Maybe stretching that a little bit, but, whereas in pharma, could require just the same amount of brain power and you make far less, and your entrepreneurial sort of goals are limited. Just to do a mouse experiment in pharma can cost $1 million. And meanwhile there are guys that like reach PMF and profitability with that. So I feel like it's just a better business. It's more fun, et cetera. I wouldn't rule out kind of a return to pharma, but there's a lot of hoops that I have to sort of jump through legally, one, and then two, I'd sort of have to get my head around, like, is this worth doing? I've thought about doing it certainly in Europe where, like, for example, that pantothenate disease, I still have like these residual ideas for drugs that I think could work really well, and doing them in Europe, and then sort of backing into the US, where I'm literally banned from the pharmaceutical industry, like one of the first people ever banned from an industry. It's I feel like lawfare incarnate. But I still could probably persist, whether it's with the Trump administration or through Europe or something like that. So I would never say never, but it's kind of one of these industries that's also been doing really poorly, especially relative to something like software, because that target ID problem we've been talking about for the last hour, that is such a difficult problem that when there is a good target, every company has one. So when the PD-1 miracle happened with oncology, Bristol Myers and Merck both had this PD-1 antibody that changed the game for cancer, Keytruda and Opdivo. And within years, virtually every single drug company had a PD-1 inhibitor because there just weren't that many great targets to go seek. And even the ones that didn't work, there were a bunch of them like TIGIT and some of these other LAG-3, all these other oncology targets that kind of got hot because of a mouse study or something. Before you know it, like 8 companies are already in clinical trials of LAG-3 inhibitor. So it's this vicious competition to find a good target and prosecute and develop it to the point where you have medicine. And the capacity problem, it's kind of like the steel industry or something. Like there's too much capacity in biopharma and there's too much money in it and not enough like actual novel kind of targets. And again, maybe I'll be proven wrong and some great AI tool can actually find new targets, but there's only 40 drugs FDA approved every year. It's like very small amount. And a lot of those are like Tylenol XR, or like something that's like just very like non-innovative. And so there's really like 20-ish kind of drugs that are truly interesting advances. Some of them are not that great. And so you're looking at a very small number of drugs that are actually moving the needle for people, and the amount of people that can benefit from those financially. Well, big pharma wants 8 or 9 of those, or sort of 15 or 16 of those 20, and then like really big venture / PE wants, and public biotech wants the rest. And so for somebody to just say, I'm going to do this, I'm going to make it work, it's a 10-year odyssey to get one of these drugs approved, and hundreds of millions of dollars. So it's sort of a business that I fell into, as a hedge fund guy, studying these stocks. And then I said, I could kind of do this myself too. And, it's certainly not a bad business if you have access to like huge amounts of capital and lots of really creative ideas. But even then, like, it's just not an easy industry either. I mean, you're dealing with a lot of stochastic noise. You do a clinical trial, like ketamine was a really good example. We were one of the first companies chasing ketamine, us and Johnson & Johnson. And the data looked so good coming out of Yale University for depression, for really serious depression. And we thought that the phase 3s would be like a piece of cake. It turns out they weren't a piece of cake. Ketamine has a great effect. It's better than SSRIs. But it wasn't the miracle that, Yale sort of pointed it out to be and got us all excited. It was a little bit south of that, a little bit north of SSRIs. And it turns out that development would not have been the easiest thing in the world. We ended up selling that medicine, but it was one of these things where, you don't always get what you want in pharma. And unlike tech, where like, if you can make a change to the code base, you can't change a molecule. You start from scratch. So there's a lot of differences where, it ends up being, really tricky and really hard to always get things right.
So actually, I really want to ask you about how you got up to speed in AI, because when I first talked to you, I was kind of astonished by your like technical, depth in that field as well. But I also want to make sure I touched on something I'm sure it's like on people's minds or listeners, which is, so what actually caused you to go to jail, and like what was that experience like? I know we've talked about that a lot, but I just feel like I gotta ask that.
Yeah. It was wild. I mean, it was really wild. It's probably
Yeah.
what's like Sam Bankman's thinking right now. The guy went to
Right.
math camp. He's probably the first guy ever to go to math camp and then go to federal prison.
Well, you probably went to math camp too, right? I mean,
I mean, I didn't. My entire summers were just like staying at home programming. But you're fish out of water. I mean, that's for sure.
well, first of all, what was the actual like crime here?
Fraud. Yeah, so fraud. So fraud's like this very vague word, and like the more and more we look at Silicon Valley, I think you could probably throw that word up a lot more if you wanted to. And I feel like, for me, being a bad guy, being like a world-renowned bad guy, sort of, I think, helped government say, especially, one of the ways I was a bad guy was not only telling the media that I didn't think that their opinion mattered and that I could tell my own story, it was also telling government the same thing. And I think eventually, sort of push comes to shove, I was getting into a lot of fights with, say, Hillary Clinton and some other folks. And, I didn't care about the party or anything like that. What I cared about was that ever since I studied economics, it is a company's right to charge whatever price it wants for its products and services. You can raise the price of your product and service tomorrow. Your users might go to somewhere else, and that's just something you have to deal with. You have to decide balancing, the customer's needs with your needs and your employees' needs and your investors' needs and all that stuff. And you decide, and you may change the price higher, you may change it lower, depending on the case. And it's kind of one of the first things you learn, like from Warren Buffett, for example, who, reading all of his work over the last, couple of, 20 or so years, I've been studying this stuff. Pricing power is very important. And so for me, the idea that a company chooses its price and the company's owner chooses the price is really like holy to me. And, I sort of got the sense that some of these politicians wanted to remove that power. And I was really like, look, you can't change that. That's what makes capitalism. That's what makes economics in America great. This day that you say that you're going to look at my portfolio and you're going to decide what the prices are going to be, I mean, you might as well, move to another country. It's over. And that idea was creeping in. And I think the politicians used me as a little bit of a foil for like, look how bad this guy is. We need to be able to have that power too. And, I was frustrated by that. And I would sort of get into it with Hillary or whomever and say, look, you don't have that power. You'll never have that power. And, I sort of like, kind of like poking my nose at them saying, you can say what you want, but you're not going to change the price of my drug. You're not going to goad me into changing it either. And eventually, I think the powers that be tend to coalesce around and I'm going to sort of sound like a conspiracy theorist here, and I really did in 2015. But this idea of lawfare, which is that here's a bad person, we're going to find a way to sort of like mess with them. So I had a hedge fund that I started that did actually very well. It returned about 4 to 5x capital. In hedge funds, that's a lot more. Like venture capital, it's almost like normal. Hedge funds, that's
not normal. I'll just tell you.
but it was a great result.
Yeah.
Nobody lost a dime. I didn't make any money either. But I fought the case really hard. It's very hard to fight these. I was acquitted of a lot of the conduct. A few of the charges did stick, which were things like I misled investors about our fund and things like that. None of the investors were upset. But it was technically a crime, according to them. I still maintain full innocence. And if you go into a courtroom, it's one of these surreal things where like everything is stacked against you. I mean, there's no way to win. It's a 99% conviction ratio. We actually have a higher conviction ratio than Russia and China.
So what was jail like?
It was interesting. I mean, it was definitely, I grew up in Brooklyn. It sort of harkened to that time of like low income, sort of people from broken homes, a lot of poverty, sort of the root of some of these problems. It sort of showed me there's a really interesting world that like you don't exactly get exposed to, where I think people feel like they want to climb in society, but there's no ostensible path for them, whether it's through school or through whatever. I think it's a lot of mental health problems, like people with severe like dyscalculia. I tried to teach math to folks, and like there were people that just could not, add and subtract small numbers because of like just a profound learning disability or something like that, probably went undiagnosed. And, every story I met, every person I met, one common thread was that they came from either a single parent or no parent family. And I found that to be really remarkable. I also read lots of business books, and so often was the case that the business leader would end up coming from like fairly well-to-do family, or a family that had, sort of two parents and a loving household. So, certainly lots of exceptions to that too. But in prison, there were almost no exceptions. I met one person that had like the 2.5 kids backyard kind of like, went to college sort of story out of like thousands of people. So there seemed to be that common thread. I ordered tons of books. So like I had a copy of the so-called wizard book, the SICP, MIT programming book, and many other like sort of classics for nerds. Whether Godel Terminal and stuff like that. I would just be
Did you
sitting
have
there.
a computer though?
No computer. So you're not allowed to have a computer there. I have a couple of funny stories. I'll keep it brief, but we would smuggle in cell phones, and try to sort of use those. And then there was this computer in MDC Brooklyn that was supposed to be used for discovery. So you'd look at evidence on it and prepare for your case. And it had a web browser. And it wasn't connected to the internet, but I was able to get to a dev console, and I was able to like change HTML elements. And there's like some guy, like some MS-13 gang member or something, and I would write his name, and I would write some disparaging comment, and it would be like really huge on the screen, like font 72. I'd be like, "Hey, buddy!" I look pointed to it, and everyone would laugh because says, and they'd be like, "How'd you do that, Martin? It's crazy." And good old JavaScript, but it's it's got to be really hard for, say, Sam Bankman. I mean, the lack of a computer is almost like corporal punishment. Like it's almost like unconstitutional in that it's in how we're so wedded to these devices, and taking people away from a computer. For Sam, who before he went to jail, he sent me some messages about this, and his biggest concern was internet and computer. And I think for a lot of us, that would be one of the major concerns. And it's almost unconstitutional, in my opinion, that it's sort of cruel and unusual, punishment to say, you're going to get disconnected from the internet. You're going to get disconnected from all the world's knowledge. And, you're just going to sit there and do it the old fashioned way, reading books, using telephone, stuff like that.
I mean, but it seemed, did you feel like there could be benefits to that also? Like, I honestly think if someone took away my computer for a while, I might, learn better. Like it might reprogram my brain. I don't know.
I talked about this with one of the who's who in the VC world, and he was joking that you make it sound great, Martin. Said it actually, it's I read like 300 or 400 books in prison. I made this list. I have to upload it at some point. But since I've been home, I maybe read one book cover to cover.
Wow.
And so you just don't have the time if you're running a startup or something. But sitting there, I mean, I could read books about whatever. Just, I could read a book a day sometimes, and you just have nothing else to do, and it was so enriching and awesome. But it was also, you still would rather have the computer, I think. But you could kind of make a silver lining to it at least.
Didn't you feel like angry about the situation you were in? You don't seem angry, but I don't know. Like I would think, like given what you told me, I would just be feeling like so frustrated.
I think that you probably know this really well, probably maybe better than me as an entrepreneur, that you just have to roll with the punches. Like you lose a client, you lose a key employee, stuff like that will happen. You go to jail. These kinds of things are setbacks, but they're not, going to define you. And, you know, every month at our startup, we try to like set a new revenue record, and we try to have it, a certain percentage above last month. And I don't know if we're going to make that number this month. And it just started, but I'm nervous about it already. And it's one of these things where, you know, I can only control what I get angry and nervous about. And ultimately getting nervous about something that was like this cascading effect of like, I was one of the last people who was like canceled, so to speak, before like cancellation just stopped because people just stopped believing in it. And I was one of the last people to sort of get skewered by the media before the media sort of fell apart. And I feel like, whether or not those are sort of copium and like, just sort of my own excuse for it, I still have to live my life, and getting frustrated and angry is just sort of not going to be very useful or healthy for me or anyone around me.
Well,
So the best I can do.
let me calibrate. Okay, so I spent the last 15 years of my life worrying about like revenue numbers and other KPIs and like losing sleep over it, right? So I like totally understand that. So if that's like a 5 on a scale of 1 to 10 of anxiety, like where is like thinking about like going to jail in your future? I would imagine that would be a lot higher.
Yeah, it's like an 8 or a 9. I mean, my father passed away a year or so ago, and that was like a 10 to me. It was actually harder than prison. Prison is, there's an old saying in criminal justice, there's like, you only do 2 days, your first and your last. And I do think that the sword of Damocles is actually worse than the actual prison time. Now, I also got 7 years, which was, you sort of do around 5 of that. So for Sam, he's got 25 years. We don't know what they would have given. I think maybe they did sentence Andrew. I don't remember, but you are rolling the dice with the judge, and the judge doesn't like you. They can give you 30 years. There's nothing you can do about it.
So did you actually give Sam advice about, did he call you?
I did. I don't. I kind of feel for him. A lot of people don't like him and just think, he's human garbage. But ultimately, I think he should get punished. But I don't think 30 years was the right number. He sort of operated a financial institution like the same way like JP Morgan or, look at that bank, Silicon Valley Bank that went under. Financial institutions are a little bit wild. He also, he sort of helped create Anthropic in a way, right? So like, it was, I don't know that he was like this terrible mastermind criminal. So
But
I
like,
think
what did you tell him?
I just sort of, to be explicit, I mean, I basically said that prison is a very different world from the world you grew up in. And it's a lot of minorities. There's a lot of people that just from different walks of life that you've never even thought of. And you just have to sort of respect that there are people out there that are just going to like different things, do different things, and you just have to roll with the punches. And it's a lot of cultures that you're not familiar with. I have a passing familiarity with some of it because where I grew up, but he really grew up with a silver spoon. He just basically has to, get rid of that and sort of, become a more malleable person. But I think that he is fairly like dedicated to the person he is, and like he's going to nerd out through prison from start to finish. And I don't know that that's like, I don't think he should become a gang member, but I also think he has to be flexible because you want to be comfortable in prison and you have to communicate with people and you have to be friendly and charismatic. And I don't know that he's like perfect at that. He was sort of like, he had a lot of anti-charisma, tended to put his foot in his mouth quite a bit. So I don't know. I wasn't the best, but I also think like, I just feel really bad for the people that get super long sentences. I think anybody on planet Earth could do a year or 2 in jail, I think that when you get 25 or 30 years, it's got to be soul crushing.
All right. Well, I guess switching back to AI, do you want to talk about the company that you've built?
Yeah, so I started sort of doing some AI work, and I ended up pivoting back to sort of more trad software. We tried to make TTS stuff. We tried to do uh, different stuff in LLM world, and we couldn't find a great fit. The TTS world was really awesome. I really loved it, but it was also like I was always sitting there trying to convince others, but also myself, that this would be a big market. And I remember the Nuance acquisition that Microsoft did, and it's a really big market, but ultimately they succeeded not by making TTS technology or speech to text ASR. They succeeded by kind of packaging it with a product, especially targeted towards like doctors and stuff like that. So to me, like this age old question of like, do you want to build the technology, or do you want to build a product, and what layer do you want to be in? And I think like it'd be really fascinating to see how companies like Levin Labs progress. But one of the problems that I constantly thought about, again, trying to convince other people, is that we're going to have an audio sort of web, and that maybe not every part of the web is going to be audio driven, but even a little bit more, is going to be a big deal, because the LLM output, people don't want to read all this stuff. I almost called the company TLDR, because people just don't want to read and read and read pages and pages of text. And it was, they'd rather hear it. And it's why people watch podcasts and listen to them. There's less cognitive load than sitting there reading a transcript. And I feel like, I felt that after a while, I was like just convincing myself, and I'm not even sure I believed it. I think the TTS space is like $1 billion-ish in revenue total across every company. And a lot of that revenue lives at like IBM and AWS and GCP and Azure and companies that like you wouldn't necessarily think of as great providers. And I feel like I don't know if people are going to make money in this space. Like I feel like it's this very like niche space. We still wanted to do it, and it was a lot of fun, but I feel like you know it's just really super niche. Even though like the Sesame AI demo I thought was really amazing.
Totally.
This Rebase thing, and I feel like there will be room for that, and I feel like so I'm of two minds about it. Like I feel like every content company like Disney should have a Darth Vader or whatever characters they have, and they should have them custom made for you and your kids and things like that. And there's no reason SpongeBob shouldn't have a dedicated episode just to you every day. And this is all doable with TTS and increasingly with other companies. But you also have the bigger companies that have better scale, like OpenAI does TTS and things like that. So we gave up on it just because we couldn't get real big revenue traction. And one of the funniest things, I think you'll appreciate this, is that we took this saying by Greg Brockman really seriously. He said that it's easier to teach good software engineers AI than it is to teach AI people good software engineering. We tried, but it wasn't that easy. And we were just sitting there, reading everything we could find. Deep learning, we made a lot of like, we rewrote a bunch of Torch. We made I made a pull request, my own pull request to deep speed, the Microsoft library. But like ultimately, this stuff ain't easy. There's a reason it's very difficult. And
it's frustrating too, right? It's like I feel like when I write software, I get the satisfaction of like shipping like every day, every week. Whereas like I feel like you can easily spend like months on like a ML project and just you're like, shit, I got nowhere, and I don't know why.
Yeah, it was really challenging, and we kind of followed this wild TTS story about this guy James Betker, who kind of solo developed this soda TTS, and he's over at OpenAI now. But at the time, he just open sourced the soda TTS, and lots of companies tried to sort of take it and make it a managed service. And I think the key there was first mover advantage was really important there. Really high quality audio was really important. Every little mistake that a model would make could be disastrous to your reputation. And it was one of these words of mouth things where people would say, what's the best TTS? Oh, it's definitely this. And when you get that kind of word of mouth going, you're going to do really well. But I still wonder if this market's going to be, that reliable, because one of the fears you have to have in the back of your mind is that, okay, as compute becomes cheaper and data becomes cheaper and these models become open source, what's to stop like some model in Hugging Face from that's like really good and can run locally, like just going to use that? Like, why do we need anything else? And speech still has like a bit of like issues with like trying to get the whole context of like the whole page or the whole book. And a lot of times people just chunk speech into sentences and pray that it has the right prosody and stuff like that. But like, it's very different if like somebody in this one sentence, this character is a bad guy, when they say the bad guy's name, it might actually inflect differently from like if he's the character's lover or something. So, that kind of context is sort of missing from TTS. And but these last miles will sort of get met with. And I think like dialogue models and like really cutting edge stuff where like people are talking over each other and like really natural sounding speech, it's going to happen. And I don't know that like there's some big customer that's going to really do well with it. My dream was like customer agents and service agents would need to be embodied with these TTS voices. We'll see how these companies do. I mean, I think it's a really cool space. So we really like that part. I also thought about doing AI for physicians, which was its own interesting thing. We see every day that, knowledge workers are going to get disintermediated. We're not going to have knowledge workers anymore. Well, healthcare costs are something I know a lot about. I've been in the news about, and a big chunk of healthcare costs, if not the majority, are human labor. And that labor can a lot of it is like workflow chart, like flow charts and stuff like that, like hypertension. If the patient is not on any medicine and they're 130 systolic, use this drug. That's not working, use this drug. That's not working, use that drug. And it's like actually fairly simple stuff. Like a doctor is, it is important, but like you could pretty much encapsulate all medicine in an LLM if it's basically already happened. The question is like, how do you actually get that to actual real costs? And I think that we're going to learn that like doctors have this very serious lobby that they enjoy, these huge reimbursement fees, and that the idea that a machine could do it better, is something that's very scary to folks. We had a nice talk with a Middle Eastern country that didn't care. They said, we can cut our healthcare costs a huge amount by just forcing people to use an AI doctor. And this was a country that was willing to sort of just say, to hell with it. And I feel like eventually that's going to happen in the US. 2/3 of this deficit, or 3/4 of this budget deficit that we have, I don't know if maybe it's like a half, is Medicare and Medicaid. And so like this gigantic deficit that's causing all these problems that could result in like US insolvency someday is just healthcare. And, all that could be done by AI theoretically. And, maybe someday human robotics too. But,
why did you do it? Why are you, what?
I think it like we did okay with it. It felt like, getting commercial traction would be difficult. Other people have sort of danced around this bush. Like a lot of people are taking it from the clinician payer side, which I think is smart. We were trying to do it from the consumer side, and get people to sort of reduce their costs and when they maybe get insurers to pay for it. I feel like we didn't get that much traction. Like we got a lot of people trying it, but we also felt at the end of the day that like this is actually going to be the big value prop potentially for the foundation model companies. That like, Elon actually tweeted that, I think he probably had to be pretty careful what he said, but he said, use Grok as a second opinion. And like, that's true. I mean, it's probably a better second opinion than most doctors. And, what an awesome thing. But like, do you want to, compete with that? And, have your own, like these dedicated LLMs for specific like areas? I don't know that those are going to work. Look at, Cursor and stuff like that. Like you're just piping into, the foundation model LLMs. So you're not making a code specific LLM. At least with the same technology or same sort of framework or architecture. So I don't know that like a medical LLM makes sense. Like it's just a regular LLM, and that's really done well by a bunch of companies, and trying to do that didn't make too much sense for us. So like it was one of these things where we got usage but not revenue, and B2C in general is like something where it's really hard to get revenue. So we sort of settled in on this financial product that I've always had this dream of, and being a lifelong trader, lifelong investor, building my own sort of financial suite was always my dream. And in fact, how I got to get sort of fall in love with JavaScript. I started BASIC and Pascal and stuff like that. And, I never programmed JavaScript until I literally got arrested. I mean, then it was the darkest of moments. I turned to JavaScript and I actually had some free time. I was going to fight the government and prepare. And I basically said, let me go back to like an original love. And I very quickly realized that this was awesome. And I missed it from my youth. So I started to make some little financial programs, and it evolved into this really big suite that we have now. And it's the most fun I've had in a really long time. But in terms of AI, I think the pressure to put AI on everything is sort of like, it's being seen in finance a little bit, in finance software. It still hasn't really been done right. So I hope to do something right there, but we're almost like completely trad like software now. Like, I don't think we have any torch in anything we do right now. Like, at some point, I do think that we can do some cool stuff with AI, but I feel like, the contrived kind of like chat with this, chat with your documents or, whatever. It's a little bit too forced. I do think there's a real huge use for AI in finance. It's just not so obvious. And
so I was watching your kind of live streams, and you gave me a super cool demo of your product. And I guess like for people that are maybe like listening to this and not traders, it like appears to me like it's sort of like this like kind of monster BI tool where you like put up tons of graphs and like tables and stuff, and it seems like you like to have just like zillions of like metrics spread out like all across your screen. And I guess I was like looking at that as like a non-trader and thinking like, I'm not sure that's how I would want to ingest data about my own company. So like, is there something different? Like, are you just really feeding your like ADHD and anxiety as a trader by like putting so much information there? Or is it actually like helping you trade better?
It's a really good question. I think that if you walk around a trading desk, like, it looks like that, like the people are constantly on the phone. They're like, they're ADHD'd whether they like it or not. And I feel like sifting through lots of securities, all of these things kind of are, to me, very reminiscent of a programmer's job, in that if you're going to spend 8 to 10 hours a day coding, you want the exact right command line setup, the right, like, even people like get very serious about their Vim setup. Like, every little thing's got to be perfect. And I'm not like that, but like, there are some things that I like. And if I'm going to do it for 10 hours a day, I might as well get those little things done right. And I think that financial software is very similar. If you're going to, it's very well known how long bankers spend in the office and stuff like that. But any financial person spending, 10 hours in the office every day, and they are going to look at stocks or bonds or whatever they look at, they're going to do it constantly over and over and over again. And I feel like you have to give them a command line style tool that helps them get that information quickly. And it's going to be a little bit ugly and scattered and all over the place, but that's sort of a feature instead of a bug, because if it looked like, a SaaS site, it would frustrate the investor, because they're like, okay, well, I just looked at Apple, but now I want to look at something else. I want it to take like a millisecond. I don't want it to take like refreshing this page or trying to hydrate the page, or just show me the data right away. And I feel like, that's really important to Wall Street. Now, in terms of AI, there's a lot of places where this could help. And I know that a lot of the quants are starting to do work with LLMs. And so we're sort of trying to race to provide those tools too. But I think like the stuff that I've seen, which is like chat with a 10Q document or a 10K document, it can be a little bit simple, but a lot of the times like Control F works, and I don't know that you.
But like, what is a trader doing? Because like, I look at like it's like you're looking at a bunch of graphs and then trying to make some prediction. I mean, that sounds like how are you going to possibly be AI at that? Like, isn't it that like best case scenario for AI to do well?
I think AI trading is going to make quant trading even better and even harder for humans to do well in. I mean, I think that humans have a small edge when it comes to like judging markets, emotional states of like traders, other traders, and things like that. Integrating lots of like disparate pieces of information. Like, if you see a little clue about inflation from one company and then another little clue from another company, and you start to connect a narrative that like, okay, maybe inflation's going up, I'm going to do something with bonds or something like that. That's the kind of thing that maybe AI can't see right away. But in terms of like super high frequency trading, the computers have dominated that. Trading the news is something that I'm really interested in, that I know a lot of other like LLM type folks are interested in, whether they're coming from the quant side pointing to the LM side or the LM side pointing to the quant side. The question is, can you have a computer that just reads breaking news really quickly and reacts to it really quickly? And that's one of the products we're working on that I think is going to be really helpful, because you'd be surprised at how much breaking news there is that hangs in limbo, and the market's like still trying to figure out if this information is real or not. The LLM can make that call in a second and then make the trade. And I feel like that's going to be a big game changer. But of course, like all things in finance, everyone will have it within like 6 months or a year. And, you can very quickly react to things. Like just the other day, just today, it was Hims announced that they were going to carry a GLP product, which was going to be good news for Hims. But it sort of took the market like a few minutes to really like digest it, whereas the LLM would like just be immediately like, yeah, buy that. And I feel like that is a product that certain big firms are making, but nobody's making it for the little guy. And I'd like to make those types of products for even, I mean, firms too, but also the little guy. And there's all kinds of other little nuances in finance that could really benefit from this. Traders themselves, I mean, they've mostly been wiped out by computers. I feel like there's still hedge funds out there with humans. They pale in comparison usually to the quant hedge funds. We're also considering, how do we bring quant tools to people too?
But
Because
wait, are you trading? Like it looks like on your live stream you're trading. Is that so? You yourself have not been wiped out by. But
No, I think there are still people that can do it. I think that it's a fool's errand. I mean, it's sort of like Kasparov versus Deep Blue. Like you could see the writing on the wall even years ago, and today, like they're still good chess players, but it's really hard to play Deep Blue. And I feel like you're going to have a time and place where, like, say, private equity or venture capital, like these are places that are like AI is not going to compete with for another 10 or 20, 30, 40, 50 years, maybe. Somebody's going to come up with a startup that competes with yours and say, who are these guys? Is it that guy I met at MIT, or is it that guy I know from Anthropic? And it's like, no, it's a fucking machine. It's an LLM. And it's that would be really, really ironic, because you sit there like, let's unplug it or something, but the reality is, like, the markets have always been competitive, and I feel like there are some people that believe, they often trick themselves into thinking that they have an edge. And one of my goals is to help people see that signing up for Robinhood, putting your weekly paycheck into it, and like trying to guess that this stock is going to go up or down is not something that is probably something you should do. And is there a way to do it a little bit more intelligently, that is less risky and maybe more rewarding, is one of the things we're trying to think about. But I agree that, like, trying to make trading software or software for research analysts in 2025, where the research analyst has kind of become a dinosaur and a thing of the past, is something that, like, certainly, like, for us, like, we understand that, like, Wall Street's completely changed. It used to be cigar smoking, blue blood sort of frat bro type environment in the 90s. And now it's mostly quants, IMO winners, stuff like that, and I feel like you have to make tools for those guys. And so we are sort of trying to get there. And I think we will, but I also think, like, Wall Street hasn't collapsed yet. There's still sort of people doing that stuff. And, you also have a lot of other things you could do with this type of framework. Like Bloomberg is a really interesting company where, like, they're the time series data company. And they do it really well for stocks, but they should kind of stop doing it for other things. And I think that you could actually look at tons of unstructured or structured data and render it more easily, and take the unstructured data, and Google and LLMs can do that better. But if you know what data you're looking at and you look at it every day, like, we can graph that. It doesn't have to be a stock or a bond. It can be, weather, or it could be, some other shipment data or something. And so, like, I hope that, we can sort of show that stuff. It's working really well. We have millions of dollars of revenue now. I'm really lucky. It was really hard sort of finding PMF. We tried three different things, and none of them sort of connected. The first one didn't connect at all with anything. The next one sort of connected a little bit with users, but not revenue. The next one, the TTS product, connected a little bit with revenue and a little bit with users. But this product's just sort of, gone off the charts. And
the thing I admire about your product from, I guess, like one entrepreneur to another is, I think, very similar to, Weights and Biases. I think we were kind of building this really specialized thing for an audience we really understood. And more than understood, I think we, like, loved them, like, we kind of came from that, like, really wanted to make something good. And I can kind of see from your live stream, like you're doing the same thing. Like you are like a user of your product, you kind of know the people using it. You have a very idiosyncratic UI that clearly comes from like a lot of like caring about it being a good product for your audience. Like you really feel that in your product. So I just really admire that from afar, although I'm absolutely not a trader.
Yeah, I mean, this is what Toby said. I saw a video the other day where Toby Lutke said something like, the only way you're going to ever make a great product is if you really care about it, you really love it. And I feel like, we probably should have seen that all along, because I love investing, I love trading, and every little detail, is something that I obsess about, because I know what I would feel if somebody was selling me this software. I'd say, no, I don't want to use this anymore if it's going to have this thing there, or that thing's going to be wrong. And the developers don't always understand that. We actually try to make or find people, or encourage all of our team to invest, and so they really understand, like, maybe not more than 10 minutes a day sometimes, but at least a little bit of market activity, so they can sort of understand what the user's going through. So I feel like it's a really amazing area, because traders have money. They love spending money on software, and it's a really kind of remarkable, awesome thing. So we sort of sat around the first year or two of our company sort of meandering, and I don't regret it, but now that like our revenue is just going crazy, and we're hiring like crazy and all that stuff, I'm really lucky and happy that we're sort of hitting that. But I also now have to start thinking about harder things, like, well, how do we 10x our revenue, and then how do we make products that people really, really like and really, are valuable for them. I think, again, the stuff like Robinhood and other companies, they help the user to gamble, and I want to help our users really actually make money. And it's something that's I'm pretty passionate about, and we'll see if I can sort of get that to work. We still haven't actually released our product, so it's all been sort of in this kind of weird beta stage. So one day we'll tweet about it or put it in the Wall Street Journal or whatever, and it'll sort of hopefully 10x or 20x then. But for now, it's like this is actually very hard software to make. And
do you want to put a link in our notes, or tell us where
sure.
to...
That's fine. But the trying to get, because I saw Perplexity was trying to do a finance thing, and I think that Kamath sort of like made a wisecrack about it, that just showing one or two charts doesn't replace a Bloomberg, and that I do think that's true. It's really hard to sort of like negotiate with the Frankfurt stock exchange, and then Osaka and Tokyo, and like herd all these cats and get all these vendors and like write tests to make sure that if any of that data is late or something like that, you do some emergency thing. And like, it's mind-boggling how complex this machine is. And that's sort of a moat in a way. And the UI, I think, is where things really shine. I mean, just it's Vim for finance in a way. And I think that's like, to anybody who's stuck sitting down like in an office just hacking away at finance, it's code in a different language, and this is the sort of like thing you need. So I'm really lucky and happy, and again, I had a lot of patience from investors to sort of like find our footing, and now we're in the same grind that like everybody that gets the PMF is, which is what's the revenue, what's the growth, and how fast can you grow, and every month is going to be a challenge.
It's more fun searching for PMF, I'll tell you. It's better.
Yeah, I think like looking at like the Levels of the world, I actually tried to buy a company from Levels. I called him, I sent him a DM, and he said, "Oh, great, Martin, I love your stuff. I'm a fan." I said, "That's great. Give me your number. Let me give you a call." And he said, "No, I'm too what are the words? I'm grinding right now, or like I'm too locked in." And I was like,
nice.
I'm trying to buy your company. I didn't even say anything. I was just like, all right, man, let's stay locked in. But I think these solopreneurs are really something. I mean, I think that you're going to see more and more of these, and like, we may get our first solopreneur IPO or something someday, where somebody's like, yeah, I built this all by myself. I built a whole SaaS company. I own 100% of the equity, and it's a multi-billion-dollar company. And totally. I think we're going to see that, more and more, thanks to companies like yours and others like that have built this amazing ecosystem. You can never do it for our company, by the way, so don't even try. But the complexity is just,
you need at least 10 people or however many you have.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, well, actually, one of the spicy takes that I found of yours from like, I don't know, like 6 months ago or something, was saying, AI is going to kind of enter a bubble and the bubble's going to pop, which like you could argue that was extremely prescient. I'm not sure like where you feel like we are in like a hype cycle, or if you're expecting like a bigger bubble. But it does sort of feel like we actually kind of had maybe like a peak maybe 2 months ago, and maybe we're coming down from there? What's your take?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I think that in the 90s, this happened with dot-coms too. There was kind of like this, it wasn't just dot-coms, but it was a mix of like dot-coms and other tech, including like communications technology. And so you had this bubble, and it felt like maybe you're getting to a sigmoid, but then and it sort of did another big gap. And I feel like that's probably going to happen here. I think this is like maybe one of the bubbles to end all bubbles. And one of the funny things about it is that in every bubble, sometimes you actually sit there and think maybe it's real, and I think the smartest people after a while are like, I don't know, maybe I should do internet stocks. And I feel like that's exactly what's going to happen here. I think OpenAI will go public. I think it'll be $1 trillion market cap. I think that the bubble will get bigger. I feel like it's possible it all comes tumbling down tomorrow, but I also feel like almost more than the internet, like AI has immediate impacts for a lot of organizations. And the other key thing is that the biggest beneficiary is going to be companies like Verizon and Procter and Gamble and stuff like that, where they're going to be able to like save $1 billion here and there, which is a huge amount for the S&P 500, where they can save some money, deploying AI tools, and maybe they can spend money using products like yours to sort of say, what can we do with the data that we do have internally? Really smart companies will pass those savings on to efforts like that. But I think that the internet did that for so many different S&P 500 companies. It's what fueled global growth. And so AI has been fueling global growth and will continue to, make GDP growth go up and productivity go up. And I feel like, that is, that's when a bubble can actually continue to inflate. I mean, I feel like, once you have, OpenAI is a lot of revenue. In the dot-com era, nobody had revenue. So you have actual progress, you have actual product, you have like amazing technological advances. This is sort of the real deal. The big question is, what do investors do about it? And I feel like investors are somewhat sober. You have some of these valuations that look a little bit large, but by and large, like, folks aren't funding, just because a company has, AI in the name. Back then, if you had a dot-com in your name, you'd go public. Morgan Stanley would take you public. Today, it's not that easy. It's still, the big firms are not just funding anything. They're being fairly judicious about, where they put money to work, whether it's Sequoia or Founders Fund or A16Z. And I think that when you start seeing people get really sloppy, it's kind of like when the bubble has really hit. And I feel like once those firms started to do like really dumb stuff, which they tend not to do, but even the smartest people sort of get wrapped up into this, I think then we'll sort of know the bubble's really here and going to blow up. But for now, I mean, it sort of worked. I feel like, you're closer to the vest on this. You're in the thick of it. But so far, I mean, the valuations that I see for like brand new startups, the founders want a lot, but like oftentimes the investors really do get to make the call. And, I don't sense that it's really, really bad yet. I feel like, 100 times sales for a SaaS fast growth startup is actually fairly rational. So, you see that number kind of thrown around a bit. And, so there's real substance here. I think that one of the problems is going to be, how do you actually take AI and make something real? We're just having like the idea itself is probably not going to do very well. I mean, if you try to say I'm going to do AI for X, that's sort of a recipe for disaster. But I do think that really focused ideas and really good teams will be able to do it. I also feel like at the end of the day, like your customer business rules haven't changed. Your customer matters. Your product quality matters. All of those things matter. So like I feel like I do see some companies, and you probably see this too, where they feel like they have a really good engineering team. They feel like they're going to do something really special on the technology side, and they don't connect at all with customers, and they don't do anything. So I feel like that has happened, but I wouldn't call that a bubble bursting as much as it is like, this happened to dot-coms too, or it was like just a misapplication of the technology. So
your view is that we're at the start of a bubble. Is that a good summary of your?
Yeah. It's so hard to explain, right? Like I feel like in dot-com, there's just indiscriminate craziness. It was like mania. You don't get that mania today. Like it's still very like, kind of rational and sober. When you see something really wild and really like sometimes something like the robotic stuff that's happening right now is a little bit like a sign of like, non-sobriety. And so like if you see like something where, some robotics company with no product, no revenue is raising at 100 billion or something wild, that's obviously bubble behavior. But at the same time, like you sit there and think, it's human labor. I mean, maybe that could be $100 billion, maybe it could be $100 trillion company. So I feel like there's relatively sort of like, I don't know that we're even in a bubble. I feel like a lot of it is rational. We'll have to see, but and again, you see more than I do, but Wall Street hasn't had this parade of IPOs. There have been some IPOs where companies have had to temper their expectations from the private market. So I think like to some extent there's like a lot of VC money, and the roles have reversed. In the dot-com bubble, there wasn't much VC money, and companies went public to get the stupid money and to get the crazy prices. Now you kind of get the crazy prices privately, and when you go to public, you have a reality check where it's like, no, Wall Street's not gonna buy that. And I feel like, because the private markets have been disintermediated by these mega sort of VC and growth funds, we actually can't tell, right? Because like the price discovery isn't necessarily there. So you have like a $5 billion company announce it's closing up. And it's like, how's that possible? And it's like, oh, the VCs quit on it, and it actually wasn't worth $5 billion. It was just a mark. So I think that so many things about like the ways you can even detect a bubble have changed. So we'll probably know the answer to this like 5 years from now way better than we know it today.
Awesome. Well, I've kept you over. I want to let you go, but I did have one last question I wanted to ask you. Is just that like I saw you bought the Wu-Tang album. Were you a Wu-Tang fan?
Yeah, I'm a rap fan. I'm from New York, home of hip hop. I think that art, is one of these cool things you could do with art is, and sort of when you make a lot of money, the patronage of art. So many people will buy like a Picasso or Monet or whatever, and say, well, this thing's really expensive. What a trophy, And I feel like if you do sell a startup or come into some money, like one of the best things you could do with it is make your own trophies. And I feel like this is like the coolest thing you could do. Assuming you do anybody would want to do this, but like recently the $40 million dinosaur skeleton was like the most complete, dinosaur like ever found, was sold at auction for 40 million. And it's like, that's something like I could see like a founder like you or like somebody who like had a big success say like, oh yeah, I want the world's like best dinosaur in my backyard, And for me, here was this music album where nobody had ever paid a lot of money for a piece of music ever. And I thought it was a really cool idea that should be explored more because music's so important to us. Whereas like impressionist art doesn't play a role in my everyday life, but like for a lot of us, we have our headphones on, we're listening to music. It's a huge thing for us. So why doesn't Taylor Swift or Drake or somebody like that make albums for a patron? And they get to really channel their voice without thinking about commercial output, and just say, I'm going to make the best art I can. And whether people like it or not, it's irrelevant because Elon gave me 10 million to do it. And I feel like that's like, potentially a new paradigm for art. And it was kind of the old paradigm for art. So I feel like that was a really interesting statement to make. But I've done some other things like that where the traditional things you do with money can often be just like really trite, and it's not you. Like you buy painting, you're like, I did this, or like you buy summer house, or you do all the rich person stuff, and then you're like, this isn't me. So for me, like one of the things I really wanted to do is collect really old computers, like the first Apple ones, like like really old things like that. I collect letters.
Wait, there was a museum in Seattle. Did you ever go to it that had all them working? It was amazing.
Yeah, I haven't been yet, but
wow. Yeah, I guess I think it was one of the Microsoft. Paul Allen, I think, was also a collector of the stuff and made it available. So if you do get a good collection, let me come over and play with it.
Yeah, they occasionally will go to auction for these like Apple 1s and 2s, and
cool.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, it's funny. I loved I remember when the Wu-Tang came out when I was a kid, and it really spoke to me as like, definitely not the target demographic. And then I remember going to a show in like 2010 and running into like 20 other like startup CEOs that I knew in San Francisco, just being like, "Huh, this is," I mean, absolutely terrible show. Like, I think they had gotten old and like were really bad, but it's just funny to like see that connection with like a lot of other people at once.
Someone did do this like the numerical analysis or some other data science analysis of Wu-Tang vocabulary, and it was like many sigma to the right of like virtually any other rapper. Now it's a group of guys, so it's a little bit different, but even still, like the lexicon of Wu-Tang is like massively larger than almost any other group. So I thought that was really interesting, and that the use of the metaphor was also like very, very significant in their work.
That's like a weird mythology that I don't know, I got like really into. So yeah, anyway.
Yeah.
Also a fan. Anyway, thanks for taking the time, Martin. I really appreciate
Thank
it.
you so much.
All right, take care, man.
Bye.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Gradient Dissent. Please stay tuned for future episodes.